Hi, I'm Mike with Cashion Legal, and in this video, I'm going to break down 5 things you should know if your employer has asked you to relocate. You find yourself in a situation where your employer has asked you to move locations, whether it's to a new office in the city or a completely different city altogether. You're probably wondering whether or not you are required to comply with this request. As is the case with many legal issues, the answer is it depends. So in this video, I'm going to cover 5 things that you should know that will help inform you about whether or not the request is legal or not, and how you might be able to respond to this request. The first point that I want to make is it really depends on the terms of your employment contract. If you have an employment contract that specifically guarantees you have the right to work from a specific location, then it's very difficult for your employer to impose any type of relocation request. On the flip side, maybe your employment contract specifically contemplates the opposite. In this case, this means that your employer has a broad discretion about choosing your working location. The main takeaway with this point is that the terms of your contract will play a big role in determining the legality of the relocation request. The second point that I want to make speaks to the scenario that if you don't have an employment contract, or if your employment contract is silent on this specific issue. If your employment contract does not specifically contemplate whether or not your employer is permitted to choose the location of your work, then the underlying question is whether there's an implied term or whether the request is reasonable. The existence of an implied term depends on a variety of different factors, like whether there were discussions about this specific relocation request leading up to the start of your employment, common practice within your employer, and common practice within your industry. In the absence of express language, these factors will help inform whether there is an implied term, suggesting that it was within the contemplation of the parties that a relocation request was likely to occur at some point during the employment relationship. The third thing you should know is that there are certain things the courts will look at in order to determine whether the request is reasonable or not. For example, one of the big factors here is the distance of the transfer itself. If an employer is requesting that you transfer to a location that's just across town, then it's more likely that that relocation request will be found to be reasonable. Conversely, if you're being asked to move across the country or to a different continent altogether, there is a lower likelihood that this request will be reasonable. Another factor the courts will look at in assessing the reasonability of the request is whether or not the employer has offered to pay for your moving expenses. And finally, another thing that the courts will consider are your personal circumstances. For example, if you have a family or some other non-professional obligation that ties you to a particular location, this will be a factor that the courts will look at. The fourth thing that you should know is that you're permitted to consider the request and you don't have to accept the transfer right away. If your employer has presented you with a relocation request, they cannot force you to agree to this immediately. So if you find yourself in this situation, you're well within your rights to say, hey, give me some time to think about this. You can use this opportunity to get legal advice and consider what the next best step is for you. The fifth and final thing that I want to share is that if the relocation request is not legal, you might be able to pursue a claim for constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal is a legal remedy that occurs when your employer commits a breach of your employment contract. In this situation, you're permitted to resign from your employment and pursue a claim against your employer as if you had been dismissed. However, constructive dismissal is incredibly risky and very difficult and complicated to pursue, so this is definitely not something you should do without the benefit of legal advice. I'm Mike with Cashion Legal, and we're an employment law firm based out of Calgary, Alberta. We help both employees and employers with relocation requests and constructive dismissal claims. If the content of this video is applicable to your situation, or if you need advice on another employment law issue, do not hesitate to click the link to our website and book a case evaluation with our office today.